Hey there folks, welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Apologies for the clickbait title and thumbnail, but really it's not clickbait. But target range DPS and showcases are 100% clickbait. Don't ever listen to a guy that's not playing on Apocalypse and not showing the build against bosses. Anyway, today I want to discuss the best build in the game, and more importantly, why it's the best build in the game. So we're going to be doing some math and stuff. And before we dive into this, I do have a couple disclaimers I want to put out first. So the first one is that while this is the best build in the game, there are plenty of comparable builds by shifting an item here or there, or a trait point, or a relic fragment, whatever. Like, there's plenty of ways to make very similar builds, and they're all going to function about the same and revolve around the same core, essentially. The second thing is that while, again, this is the best build, including hidden archetype combos, there are other setups and builds that will still function just fine and have their own niches like better AoE or better, elite burst or whatever, but they're never going to reach this level of like boss damage. Not to discourage other build making, I'm definitely going to be making a ton of other builds, but this one's important to get out of the way because it's essential to understand why it's the strongest and why nothing else is going to quite compete. Third, builds only matter on late Nightmare and Apocalypse difficulty. Everything else works just fine until then. I cannot stress this enough. Please have fun with the game and play whatever you feel like using. Builds are really only necessary to play a specific style or to crush the most difficult content. And lastly, we will not be including known bugs such as the Stone of Malevolence, the Infinite Mod Power bug, and a couple other rings that do similar things because that's going to be patched. So we're going to be playing pretty vanilla here. But anyway, let's continue. So the build, which is obviously Hunter Gunslinger, but we're going to refer to it now as HUGS for short, is the undisputed DPS king in Remnant 2. You can swap the archetype primes and go for Gunslinger and Hunter. I'm still going to call it HUGS though. And I want to explain why this setup for damage is far superior to the other archetypes. We're going to start by discussing damage modifiers, but I'm going to simplify it a bit to make it easier to understand so it's not going to be like, perfect fucking damage calculations. So in Remnant 1, we had two types of direct damage modifiers. We had additive modifiers and multiplicative modifiers. Armor modifiers were always multiplicative, while rings, amulets, and traits were all additive. What this means is that if we deal 100 damage with our imaginary gun here, and we have a 20% increase to range damage from an amulet, a 20% increase range damage from rings, and 20% range damage from a trait, we're going to deal 160 damage because we're just getting 20% for the base added 3 times essentially. We're ignoring resistances, defense, and a bunch of other stuff right now. But with the same example, if we then have a 30% damage from an armor set, if it was additive like everything else, it would give us just 30 damage because that's adding to the base damage. But if it was a multiplicative modifier, it would give us 30% damage after all the other modifiers, which instead of making our damage be 190, it would instead be 208, which is a pretty good bump. And this is how multiplicative modifiers work, because they're applying to the whole rather than to the base. Now it's important to know this because here in Remnant 2, there are no multiplicative damage modifiers. So anything that says X% increased damage is an added damage modifier to our base. So archetypes that say 25% increased damage would be the same as an amulet that says 25% increased damage, and so on. Unlike Remnant 1, all damage modifiers are equal in Remnant 2. And that's not to say there aren't any ways to get multiplicative damage, because there are, and we will be discussing that next, but it's important to realize that all damage is flat and equal. So what is a multiplicative damage stat in Remnant 2? Well, weak spot modifiers are a percentage increase over everything, so these apply after your other modifiers. Critical hits as well, they increase your damage by a percentage after all your other modifiers when they land a crit, and to a slightly lesser extent, both fire rate and reload speed are indirect damage multipliers as they're going to increase the amount of bullets you can actually shoot in a given time. So with some quick elementary examples, you can see that if we increase our fire rate, our damage increases more than just, our rate of fire because it's modifying the base damage as well as all our additive damage, as we're going to be sending out more bullets with all of our modifiers attached to them. And the same goes for critical hits and scaling crit chance and crit damage. Because these modifiers are applying at the end, they deal more damage the more you invest. And of course, this also applies to weak spot modifiers, which are important to pay attention to as well, because some weapons have different weak spot modifiers. So as you can see with this rough example of some math, You really want to apply both your multiplicative modifiers as well as your additive modifiers to make everything, buff up as much as you can. And we're talking about these because if you look at the perks and skills of both the Hunter and the Gunslinger archetype, you can see that we have multiple instances of stats that provide extra multiplicative modifiers, such as more weak spot damage, more fire rate, reload speed, critical chance, and critical damage. They're all here. No other archetype has these modifiers, by the way, save for the Challenger skill in Rampage. And because all damage is equal, if you take something like an Alchemist and Medic, which gets 50% additive damage, and look at the Gunslinger and Hunter, which gets 65% range damage, 15% fire rate, 20% reload speed, and 15% weak spot damage, and you can just see why other classes are just not going to compete with these two in terms of raw range damage output. Which is fine, obviously these are the ranged DPS classes of the game, and while they provide a lot of range damage, they don't have much in the way of survivability or extra utility. So what I'm trying to get across though is that just in terms of pure raw damage output, nothing is going to beat these two. So this is the de facto DPS boss killer archetype combo. And we can pretty much ignore all gear in this discussion as well, because really you can use the exact same gear for any ranged build. So the only thing that we're really going to be looking at is the differences between the archetypes themselves. And again, I'm only talking about range damage builds here. So of course, people are already thinking, well, what about mod damage builds? What about skill damage builds? Are they better? Can they be better? And I will cover those in later videos because I don't want to get sidetracked right now. But regarding skills and mods, the biggest reason why they're never going to ever compete with pure range builds is that they have no significant ways to scale their damage multiplicatively right now. I'm going to ignore Engineer because he is technically using a gun that can abuse weak spot damage, but the point I want to make is that mods don't get weak spot modifiers, so they can't scale with those items. They don't have any specific mod or skill crit chances or crit damage items in the game, and nothing to make them really better besides a small handful of just flat mod and skill damage items, which again are just flat values, and some extra things like cooldown reduction and mod power generation to use them more. But again, I'll go deeper into those types of builds in the coming videos. Alright, so sorry for this long, basic explanation, but it's important to understand where these builds are headed in Remnant 2, and to levy some expectations on non-ranged focused builds. Now, back to the build though. With the same general setup here, we can effectively run any ranged weapon you want. There are some outlier weapons that are just better than others, such as Nightfall, Deceit, and Crescent Moon, but really pretty much every ranged weapon you can use can hang out, so you're free to use whatever you like the most. Depending on your weapon though, you're going to want to swap a ring here or there just to suit your weapon of choice. But the staples of this set are of course going to be Xania's Malice, which is just juicy weak spot damage, and our Probability Cord crit damage ring. And the other two ring slots are totally up to you. You can run Ring of Flawed Beauty if you're consistent with your weak spot hits, you can run Devoured Loop for automatic weapons to reset your cooldowns, you can run Stone of Continuance for more skill duration, Archer's Crest for bows, Targeting Jewel for shotguns, there's plenty of good options for the last two slots. And if you're fighting one of the two bosses that don't have a weak spot, being Kayula or Legion, you can just swap the Burden of the Gambler and you'll be fine. Then for the Relic Fragments, they could be any combination of ranged crit damage, ranged fire rate, reload speed, skill duration, skill cooldown, or for shotguns you can boost spread as well. It's important to know that these Relic Fragments, when you start getting the mythic levels of them, are really, really strong, and this is where ranged really pulls ahead of skill and mod damage builds, because ranged get ranged crit damage, and weak spot damage, whereas none of that stuff applies to skills or mods. And mods don't have mod crit or mod crit damage, they don't have mod generation, there's none of that stuff to go around. So ranged really just gets every little thing in every little area to get better and better. And then for the traits, these are again dealer's choice. Since there are no damage traits, it's pretty much up to you and what you feel comfortable with. I like Vigor, so I can actually take one hit on Apocalypse, and of course Expertise is mandatory, but also Swiftness and Footwork are amazing. Movement speed is king in this game, remember that. Everything else, up to you, go crazy, you got about 20 points left. With that, you can see that we've been fighting a few bosses here on Apocalypse. I enjoy fighting Hive Mother, and it's one I can consistently no-hit, so it's going to be my target dummy for most of my tests, but I also went and fought Kayula on Apocalypse because I wanted to go against a boss without a weak spot to point out that, yeah, you'll manage just fine without weak spot stacking. And just to point out that yes, these kinds of builds shred bosses in no time, even with their immunity phases and extra adds to take care of. And again, kill times don't matter here, we're not doing speed runs or anything, especially when we're just comparing the same build to different ranged weapons. But this is going to basically be like our template for bossing here in Remnant 2. You can also run Challenger for Rampage, which is insanely strong, so don't be afraid to branch out of that a little bit. But the same general layout is pretty much going to be the same across the board. You watch anyone doing like Apocalypse no-hit bosses, and they're going to run very similar sets. Also, again, I'm not going to be comparing this to like Engineer or melee builds or mod builds. I just want to present the range damage build and kind of how they're going to look going forward, because this is the meta. Anyway, the actual build demonstration is short, but I really just wanted to hammer home how damage stacking works in Remnant 2 and kind of showcase why ranged with HUGS is king, and also emphasize that everything is usable to a degree. You can definitely make anything work, but the power gamers and the clickbaiters, we're going to be using HUGS. So I just want to get this out there. So I just want to get this video out to hopefully inform you beforehand so you don't have to fall into any more, clickbait 30-minute videos. But thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.